During the sweltering summer of 1872, 11 men lost their lives in their beds within the humid bayous of southern Louisiana. Their deaths were not due to yellow fever or consumption. As they slept, each man had his throat slit with a surgeon's exactness. At daybreak, their remains were discovered, their faces frozen in expressions caught midway between bliss and terror. All 11 were prominent members of the Knights of the White Chimera, the most dreaded chapter of the Ku Klux Klan in that region. Local authorities produced documentation stating the fatalities were unconnected incidents spanning 4 parishes. These official accounts directly contradicted both witness testimonies and tangible proof. After a period of 6 months, the investigation was discreetly terminated, and the parish magistrate commanded all documents to be placed under seal. However, within the cramped quarters of the colored districts and the secluded back chambers of freedmen's churches, a different narrative began to circulate. This account would be murmured for generations, never committed to paper, and never uttered aloud where white ears might overhear. At last, that story can be shared this evening. Before we continue with the tale of the woman known as La Noire, I require a favor from you. Please select the subscribe button at this very moment, as this channel is dedicated to revealing histories such as this one, stories that influential men wished to erase and that were deliberately concealed, and kindly inform me in the comment section which state you are listening from. Are you receiving this from the deep south, such as Louisiana? I am curious to learn where within our audience individuals are witnessing these long-forgotten chronicles resurface. The story does not truly begin in 1872. It commences 4 years earlier, amidst the embers of a war that was believed to be finished. In 1868, Street Martin Parish was an unhealed injury. The grand plantations that once yielded immense quantities of sugar and cotton now stood like decaying teeth against the Louisiana horizon. Their fields were reverting to marshland, and federal soldiers were quartered in their manor houses, or allowing them to collapse under the burden of their own past splendor. Breaux Bridge served as the parish seat. It was a collection of aged structures surrounding a courthouse that had seen its flag altered 3 times in 7 years. The former planter aristocracy was terrified by the demographic shift. Close to 4,000 former slaves were now at liberty to walk the very streets where they had once been forbidden from making eye contact with white people. Some now held property. They cast votes, and Union troops together with the Freedmen's Bureau offered them protection. They gave evidence against white defendants in court, an act so contrary to the established order that many long-term inhabitants declared it an apocalypse, the end of civilized society itself. Consequently, the Knights of the White Chimera coalesced from the remnants of Confederate veteran associations and local militias. The Louisiana Knights prided themselves on their refinement compared to their more notorious equivalents in other states. They did not wear hoods or set crosses ablaze. They were attorneys, shopkeepers, ex-officers, and plantation proprietors struggling to salvage what remained of their enterprises. They controlled the local judiciary, the sheriff's department, and the parish government. They had no need for theatrical displays. They possessed genuine authority. Their methods were calculated. If a freedman expressed himself too openly in town, his harvest might be set on fire, his mule could be lamed, and his line of credit at the trading post might be revoked. A colored man who enrolled to vote might receive a nocturnal visit from well-groomed gentlemen who would civilly explain why he ought to reconsider. Violence was a last resort, reserved only for those who refused to comply. And even then, it was orchestrated to deliver a message without provoking a response from the federal government. Each Thursday evening, the Knights convened in a private chamber at the Breaux Bridge Hotel, a 3-story inn on Main Street owned by Harold Jessup, a founding knight. The innermost circle consisted of 11 men. They determined which freedmen required a reminder of their station, which white Republicans needed encouragement to depart the parish, and which federal allies required more forceful persuasion. A woman named Celeste Dufresne entered this volatile situation on a Tuesday morning in late April. She disembarked from a New Orleans steamboat at Breaux Bridge with a single trunk and a black silk parasol. She appeared to be around 30 years of age, yet her countenance possessed an ageless quality that made pinpointing her years difficult. She was neither youthful nor elderly, but seemed to exist outside the conventional passage of time. Her complexion was the shade of café au lait, a hue that could signify anything from Creole nobility to mixed ancestry, from a dozen different Louisiana origins. She wore costly mourning attire that demanded both a skilled dressmaker and fine materials, signaling her wealth and position. She secured a room at the Breaux Bridge Hotel for 1 month in advance, paying with gold coins counted out one by one upon Harold Jessup's front desk. Her French was flawless, and her English carried a Parisian inflection that the locals found captivating. She claimed to be the widow of a French merchant who had perished in New Orleans during the yellow fever epidemic 2 summers prior. She stated she was seeking to purchase property in the parish, perhaps a modest house with some acreage where she could reside tranquilly, away from the city's sickness and disorder. The story was plausible. New Orleans had indeed been severely struck by an outbreak. French traders conducted business throughout Louisiana. Refined Creole widows often retreated to quieter towns. There was something in Celeste's demeanor that discouraged excessive inquiry. She carried a dignity and composure that suggested she was accustomed to being accorded respect. Every Sunday morning, she attended Mass at St. Bernard Catholic Church, seated in the pews reserved for established Creole families. She took her meals alone each day in the hotel dining room, reading French literature or composing letters in a tidy, meticulous script. In the afternoons, she strolled through town with her parasol shading her face, offering polite nods to passers-by without initiating discourse. She displayed no apparent interest in the racial strife fracturing the parish. She expressed no political opinions and formed no attachments to either the freedmen's community or the federal authorities. In under a fortnight, she had captured the attention of every man on the Knights' Council. It began cordially enough. Thomas Broussard, the owner of 1,500 struggling acres of cotton fields east of town, encountered her outside the general store on a Wednesday afternoon. She was examining a bolt of cloth, her gloved fingers moving over the material with expertise. He offered his assistance, mentioning he knew the storekeeper and could ensure she received a fair value. She gifted him a smile that seemed both appreciative and faintly entertained, as if she found his gallantry endearing yet unnecessary. Their conversation lasted perhaps 10 minutes. During this exchange, she spoke of the difficulties in finding a suitable property, her unfamiliarity with the locality, and her reliance on the generosity of strangers during this painful period of grief. Broussard found himself thinking of her for the remainder of the day. There was a quality about her that captivated him, an intensity of focus that made one feel like the sole person in the world when her gaze rested upon you. He felt the contact like an electric spark when she lightly placed a hand on his arm to express her thanks for his assistance. He began devising reasons to linger in the hotel foyer whenever she might pass through. He offered to show her properties that could potentially suit her needs. She accepted with a graciousness that seemed to acknowledge both his generosity and her own delicate situation as a woman without a husband. Over the following days, they traveled to view several lots of land, always with a chaperone present for propriety, and their excursions always concluded well before nightfall. Broussard informed his wife these outings were potential commercial transactions and that he was merely assisting a respectable widow as any upstanding gentleman would. Yet he could not rid his mind of Celeste. He was consumed by the way the candlelight illuminated the line of her neck, how her garments carried a scent of lavender, and how her gaze sometimes held his with an intensity that seemed to penetrate his carefully constructed respectability, glimpsing something primal and yearning beneath. The other knights observed Broussard's preoccupation, and gradually several of them also sought an acquaintance with Madame Dufresne. Antoine Lair, an attorney who had defended numerous clan members in federal court, offered his services for any property transfers she might require. Dr. Raymond Hebert, the parish coroner, expressed concern for her well-being, citing the strain of widowhood and the adjustment to a new climate. He recommended she might find value in a medical consultation. Eugene Fontenot, proprietor of the parish's largest dry goods store, extended to her a generous line of credit for any furnishings her new home might need. Celeste gracefully declined every proposal, never appearing to seek attention, yet somehow making each man feel he alone comprehended her circumstances and could provide the support she needed. They convinced themselves she was a virtuous woman enduring a difficult period. Their interest was merely courteous. It felt only natural to think of her, to invent pretexts for visiting the hotel, and to contrast her refined manners with their own wives' more provincial ways. By June, the dynamics within the Knights' Thursday gatherings had subtly shifted. The 11 men, who had once operated with military cohesion, now harbored minor rivalries and contests for prestige and influence. Broussard spoke of his afternoon carriage rides with Madame Dufresne. Lair countered with tales of his legal counsel. Hebert mentioned her delicate constitution and purported need for regular medical attention. Jessup, the hotel owner, Marcus Thibodeau, who operated the parish newspaper, Judge Vincent Thibodeau, who controlled the local courts, Sheriff Claude Devereux, banker Philippe Rousseau, and plantation owners William Duplantis and Charles Arsenault each discovered his own method of engaging with the fascinating widow. None of them perceived that Celeste had never actually purchased any land. No one questioned why a woman supposedly fleeing New Orleans would select Breaux Bridge, a turbulent backwater ripped apart by racial strife. No one found it peculiar that she seemed so composed for a bereaved widow. She never shed a tear or spoke of her deceased husband with any specificity, and none of them knew that Celeste Dufresne sat at the small desk in her room late at night, when the hotel was silent, and recorded notes in a leather-bound journal. She documented each man's routines, vulnerabilities, secrets, transgressions, his residence, who guarded his home, whether his wife slept soundly, if he kept weapons near his bed, and every other detail she would require when the time came to collect her debts. Celeste Dufresne, if that was even her true name, had not come to Breaux Bridge to acquire a house, to mourn a spouse, or to escape disease. She had arrived for a very precise purpose, one that demanded patience, foresight, and a readiness to utilize every weapon at her disposal. She had come to execute 11 men. The first death occurred on July 19, 1872, during a heat wave so severe that no one in Street Martin Parish could recall its equal. At daybreak, Thomas Broussard's wife discovered his body. He lay in their bed within the plantation house his father had bequeathed him. The incision was so profound it nearly reached his spine, severing his throat from ear to ear. The bedsheets, the mattress, and the floorboards beside the bed were saturated with blood. His countenance was peaceful, a stark contrast to the violence of the wound. His eyes were shut, his expression was serene, and his hands rested at his sides as if he had merely fallen asleep and never reawakened. The household staff came running at Mrs. Broussard's scream. Among them was an elderly black woman named Esther, who had served the family since before the war, first as a slave and now as a paid domestic. Years later, Esther would speak of what she witnessed upon entering that bedroom, though her testimony would never be entered into any official record. It was not just the corpse or the blood, but something else that defied explanation, and she knew instantly it was something she must never reveal to white people. There were 2 empty wine glasses on the nightstand. The room smelled of lavender and something else, something sweet and earthy that Esther could not identify. Mr. Broussard wore only his nightshirt, which was rucked up around his thighs. The bedclothes were disheveled in a manner suggesting vigorous activity prior to death. Mrs. Broussard had been sleeping in an adjacent room due to her own restlessness, often using separate chambers to avoid disturbing her husband. Yet, there was unmistakable evidence that Broussard had not been alone when he died. Within the hour, Sheriff Devereux and Dr. Hebert were on the scene. They inspected the premises, questioned the servants, and formulated the official account. Thomas Broussard had been murdered by an intruder, likely a disgruntled freedman, who had crept into the house under cover of darkness and slit his throat as he slept. The absence of any signs of a struggle suggested a swift and proficient killer. Nothing had been stolen, indicating the motive was personal, not robbery. The sheriff theorized it was retribution for one of the many admonitions the Knights had delivered to insolent black individuals in recent months. But Esther discovered something the white men had overlooked or chosen to ignore when she cleaned the room after the body was removed. A single, long, dark, and lustrous hair was caught in the floorboards near the bed. It was too fine to belong to Mrs. Broussard. As she stripped the sheets, she found more than just bloodstains. There were other fluids there, evidence of acts that respectable people did not discuss, but that every woman recognized. She said nothing. She obeyed Mrs. Broussard's command to burn the linens. She scrubbed the floors, scoured the blood from the wood, and opened the windows to air out the sense of death and secrecy. And when the other servants asked what she had seen, she told them only what would ensure their safety, that Mr. Broussard had been killed by an intruder, that the sheriff was investigating, and that they should all take care not to travel alone after dark. But in the colored section of town, where people had learned to perceive what white eyes willfully ignored, a different narrative began to circulate. It concerned the beautiful widow who had recently arrived and captivated so many prominent men. It also spoke of Thomas Broussard's frequent visits to the hotel, the manner in which he looked at her, Madame Dufresne, the afternoons he dedicated to escorting her to parcels of land he never appeared to discuss with his spouse, and the curious coincidence that a man notorious for his brutality toward freedmen had his throat slit mere days after being observed dining with the enigmatic Creole widow. The entire community turned out to offer their condolences at the Saturday funeral. The knights attended as a unified block, standing somberly near the burial site. These men were not fools. They understood the murder of one of their own was both a message and a proclamation of hostilities. They believed it originated from the freedmen's population or from government sympathizers. They spoke in hushed tones about the necessary response, the measures to be implemented, and which colored leaders should be made examples of. No one observed that Celeste was also present at the service. She maintained a respectful distance, clad in a black veil with her head bowed as if in prayer. None of them witnessed the slight, contented curve of her lips when she believed herself unobserved. And none of them knew that in 3 weeks' time there would be another burial. Antoine Lair died on August the 9th, his demise bearing a striking resemblance to Broussard's. He was discovered in his bachelor's residence above his legal practice. His throat had been severed, his expression was tranquil, and there were indications a woman had been in his company not long before his death. This time, the officials in charge of the inquiry, those who remained, given the sheriff and coroner were also, knights could not sustain the narrative of a chance intruder. 2 knights slain in an identical fashion within a single month suggested a design, a coordinated campaign. The whispers within the colored community grew more audible. They now referred to her as La Veuve Noire, the Black Widow, the woman who enticed wealthy white men to her bed only to slay them. Some feared her, concerned she would bring retribution upon all the freedmen. Others spoke with a grim sense of vindication, as if justice was being delivered through alternative means where the official channels had failed. The truth that white officials would not acknowledge, and that every colored person in Street Martin Parish understood without being told, was that Celeste had not selected her victims arbitrarily. Every man she seduced, every man she executed, had genuine blood on his hands. They had all participated in violence against freedmen and their families. Thomas Broussard had supervised numerous floggings and had burned down the cabin of a freedman who had filed a complaint with the Freedmen's Bureau. Antoine Lair had defended Klan members in court by intimidating colored witnesses, threatening their relatives, and ensuring true justice was never achieved. This pattern would persist with each new victim, yet the white authorities would never link the facts or inquire why these specific men were targeted. The remaining 9 knights convened an urgent meeting in the hotel's back room on August the 12th. The standard Thursday night assemblies were no longer sufficient. The crisis demanded immediate measures. They needed to identify the murderer. They had to ensure their own security. They had to re-establish order before alarm could spread through the white populace. Judge Thibodeau was the first to voice what many had been thinking but were too fearful to utter aloud. "Gentlemen," he stated, his tone laden with reluctance, "we must consider the possibility that the assassin is someone familiar to us, someone capable of gaining entry to these men's homes, someone they trusted enough to lower their defenses." No one spoke. Everyone grasped the implication. Broussard and Lair had been killed in their own beds, likely without a struggle, and following intimate relations. They had to have admitted the killer into their private spaces, and they could not have been alarmed by the individual's presence. "A woman," Dr. Hebert murmured quietly. "It would have to be a woman." They exchanged looks of dawning horror as the fragments of the puzzle connected. A beautiful woman who had recently arrived. A woman who had, in some manner, captured the interest of every man present. A woman whose history was strangely ambiguous, based solely on her own word, and a story that was merely convenient. "Madame Dufresne," Sheriff Devereaux uttered. "Dear God, it's Madame Dufresne." But even as they reached this conclusion and began discussing how to investigate her, how to establish her guilt, and how to apprehend her without creating an uproar, they faced a monumental problem. Every one of them had, at some point, been alone with her in ways they had not even admitted to themselves. Each had been charmed by her. They all harbored secrets they did not wish, exposed visits to her hotel room, gifts bestowed, promises made. To investigate her would be to investigate themselves, a prospect fraught with peril, and beneath their fear and outrage ran another undercurrent, one none would confess to: fascination. Even now, even knowing what she might be and what she might have done, many of them could not purge her from their thoughts. They could not forget how she had looked at them, touched them, and made them feel like potent men instead of bitter relics of a vanquished era. Before we delve further into this dark chronicle, you must comprehend something. This narrative is descending into depths more profound and twisted than anything you have previously encountered. If you are feeling chills and speculating how far this extended, you need to press that like button immediately. Leave a comment with your prediction of what occurs next. If you have not already, please subscribe now, because we are about to reveal how this lethal game unfolded, and you will not want to miss a single particular. Let us continue. The investigation into Celeste Dufresne commenced with extreme discretion. Judge Thibodeau employed his authority to discreetly request information from New Orleans. He dispatched telegrams to police contacts and courthouse clerks, inquiring about a Creole widow named Dufresne, whose husband was purported to have died in the yellow fever epidemic. The replies that returned were disquieting. No merchant named Dufresne had perished in New Orleans during the outbreak. No death certificate existed for anyone matching that description. Celeste's stated New Orleans address was a boarding house whose proprietor had no recollection of anyone named Dufresne. It was as if the woman had materialized from nothing, with no verifiable history. Concurrently, Sheriff Devereaux began quietly questioning hotel staff and local merchants. What he uncovered painted a portrait of a woman who was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. She attended church, purchased commonplace household items, and kept regular hours. Yet no one could claim to truly know her. Her only callers had been the knights who had paid her visits. She possessed no friends, no confidantes, no visitors. People struggled to articulate what precisely about her made them unsettled. She was always impeccably dressed and proper in her conduct, yet an indefinable quality about her provoked disquiet. The colored staff at the hotel were more forthcoming, but only when questioned in private and assured of their safety. Rachel, a housemaid, reported that Madame Dufresne's chamber contained no personal effects beyond the essentials. No correspondence, no photographs, no mementos of her deceased husband. Just garments, toilet articles, and a secured trunk she never witnessed being unlatched. The scent of lavender perpetually hung in the chamber, even in the lady's absence, as if she had imbued the very walls with her fragrance. Rachel had observed Madame Dufresne returning to the hotel very late, well past midnight, using a side entrance and moving through the corridors like a phantom. On both occasions, she carried a leather physician's bag, but Rachel could conceive of no reason a widow would require such items. The knights implemented security precautions while the inquiry proceeded. Those with families sent them to stay with relatives in other parishes, citing business necessities. Those who lived alone employed guards, former Confederate soldiers who patrolled their properties after dark. They altered their routines, changed their door locks, and kept loaded firearms within easy reach. They ceased venturing out at night unless accompanied. They grew suspicious of every noise and shadow, bracing for the next death, for they all knew it was inevitable. Dr. Raymond Hebert was the third to die. He was discovered in his medical practice on August 27th, his throat slashed, his body arranged upon his own examination table. The circumstances were nearly identical. Indications of female companionship were present. Wine glasses sat nearby, and his face bore the same serene expression in death. But this killing introduced a new element that chilled the surviving men to the bone. A small piece of paper was affixed to Dr. Hebert's chest with a surgical pin. 2 words were inscribed upon it in an elegant script: "Remember Baton Rouge." The knights instantly understood the message's meaning, though the local government and press never would. Dr. Hebert had traveled to Baton Rouge in March of 1868 to give testimony in a federal investigation into Klan violence. A colored woman named Sarah Boudreau had alleged that a group of white men, including knights from Street Martin Parish, had assaulted her husband and burned their home. Dr. Hebert had testified that Sarah's husband died not from injuries inflicted by the assailants, but from pre-existing health conditions. This lie had secured the acquittal of the accused men. 3 months later, Sarah Boudreau was found dead in a New Orleans boarding house, her throat cut. The official cause was listed as robbery, though nothing was stolen. The note made it clear Celeste was aware of these events. It also suggested a connection to them, a personal investment in seeing Dr. Hebert punished for his role. But how could she know? How could a Creole widow from New Orleans possess such intimate knowledge of the Klan's activities in Baton Rouge 4 years prior? The answer emerged from an unexpected source. Judge Thibodeau, reviewing old newspaper accounts and court documents, discovered that Sarah Boudreau had not been alone when she died. She had a daughter, approximately 12 years old at the time. Following her mother's murder, the girl had vanished. There was no further record of her fate. She had simply disappeared into the post-war chaos of Louisiana, just one more lost child among thousands. The judge presented his findings to the Knights at their next gathering, a Tuesday evening meeting at Jessup's Hotel, moved from their usual Thursday in an attempt to disrupt any patterns. He laid out the timeline. Sarah Boudreau was killed in 1868. Her daughter disappeared. And now, 4 years later, a mysterious woman arrives in Breaux Bridge and begins executing the men responsible for that murder and the wider campaign of terror against freedmen. "She's the daughter," Jessup uttered, his voice barely a whisper. "My God, she's Sarah Boudreau's daughter, returned for vengeance." But the theory presented complications. Celeste appeared to be in her 30s, far too old to be the girl who vanished in 1868. Unless her entire presentation was a meticulously crafted deception, her age, her background, her identity, all fabrications designed to grant her access to her targets. Unless she had spent 4 years plotting this campaign, identifying the responsible parties, tracking them to their current positions, and preparing for the role she had to perform. Even more disturbing to them were the theory's racial implications. If Celeste was Sarah Boudreau's daughter, she was a colored woman, despite her light skin and refined manner. She had been passing as Creole, which meant she was white enough to navigate their society without raising an alarm. Every man who had been intimate with her had broken Louisiana law, which still viewed interracial relations as a crime and a moral stain, even if they had survived her retribution. The scandal would destroy them. "We must take her now," Sheriff Devereaux declared. "Tonight, seize her before she strikes again." But Judge Thibodeau shook his head. "On what charge? We have no tangible proof. The notes cannot be entered as evidence without revealing their context. Our own investigation is compromised because we have all been involved with her. A trial would expose everything we have tried to conceal." "Then we do not hold a trial," Marcus Thibodeau, the newspaper editor, stated quietly. He had been silent until now, but his meaning was unmistakable. "We handle this as we have handled other problems, quietly and permanently." The suggestion lingered in the air like smoke. They were discussing murder, a lynching, the killing of a woman who had been convicted of no crime. It was the same method they had employed against numerous freedmen over the years. It was the same method used on Sarah Boudreau. They all saw the irony, but their fear was a more potent force than any moral qualm. They took a vote, as they always did on grave matters. 9 men remained in the Knights' inner circle. 9 hands were raised in agreement. They would kill Celeste Dufresne before she could kill again. But as they laid their plans, none of them noticed Marie, a young black woman who worked as a server at the hotel, clearing glasses in the hallway and hearing every word through the meeting room's thin walls. And none of them saw her slip away into the darkness, moving swiftly toward the colored section of town, toward a small church where certain individuals gathered people who had learned long ago that their survival depended on knowing what white folks planned before those plans could be enacted. By morning, everyone in the freedmen's community knew the Knights intended to murder La Veuve Noire. And through channels the white authorities had never understood and never would, a message was sent to the hotel, to room 7, where a widow in mourning clothes sat at a small desk, writing in her leather-bound journal. Celeste read the message, a single line of script on a piece of brown paper, and permitted herself a smile. She had anticipated this. People were so predictable in their rage and their desire for retribution. The Knights believed they were now the hunters, but they failed to grasp the fundamental truth. She had been hunting them from the moment she arrived, and the pursuit was far from concluded. She packed her few belongings into her trunk and had settled her account at the hotel desk by mid-morning. She informed the proprietor she had received word of urgent business requiring her return to New Orleans, thanked him for his hospitality, and arranged for her trunk to be transported to the steamboat landing. By noon, Celeste Dufresne had apparently departed Breaux Bridge, boarding a southbound steamboat. When the Knights learned of her departure that evening, they felt a confusing mix of relief and aggravation. She had escaped them, but at least she was gone. Surely the killings would now cease. They had no way of knowing the woman on the steamboat was not Celeste at all, but a freedwoman named Charlotte, who bore a passing resemblance and wore borrowed clothing under a heavy veil. They had no way of knowing the real Celeste had never left the parish. Instead, she had been absorbed into the colored section of town, welcomed into a small house behind the Freedmen's Church as a sister, an avenger, the instrument of justice the law had denied them. And they had no idea the murders were about to become more brazen, not less. Eugene Fontenot died on September 3rd, but not in his bed. He was killed on his journey home from his dry goods store. His throat was cut, and he was discovered at dawn in his own wagon, his horse grazing peacefully nearby. The positioning of his body suggested he had been traveling with a companion, someone he trusted enough to sit beside him in the dark, who had waited until they were isolated on a lonely road to strike. The note pinned to his chest read, "Remember the Fontenot store fire." In November of 1869, 3 freedmen had attempted to open a competing general store in Breaux Bridge. Fontenot's establishment refused to extend credit to colored customers. The new store burned to the ground within a week. The 3 proprietors and their families left the parish, and no official inquiry was ever conducted. Everyone knew who had set the blaze. Now, everyone knew the price of that knowledge. Philippe Rousseau, the banker, was next. On September 15th, his clerks discovered him dead inside his own bank when they arrived for work. It appeared he had been working late on his accounts when he was slain at his desk. The cut across his throat was so violent that blood had sprayed across the ledgers he had been examining. The note referenced a loan he had foreclosed upon in 1870, a foreclosure that violated the bank's own policies but was permitted because the debtor was a black farmer, leaving the man destitute and homeless. 5 men dead in 2 months. The pattern was now unmistakable, not just to the Knights, but to every soul in the parish. Someone was systematically executing the most powerful men in street. Martin Parish, men who had believed themselves untouchable due to their positions and their brotherhood. And somehow, despite all their precautions, the guards, the locked doors, the loaded firearms, the killer continued to reach them. The federal government, which had largely remained detached from local affairs since the early days of Reconstruction, now took notice. A.U.S. Marshall was dispatched from Baton Rouge with orders to investigate the slayings and determine if they constituted an attack on civil governance requiring military intervention. Marshal Holbrook was a stern man, a Union veteran with little affection for former Confederates. He began his investigation by questioning the remaining Knights. What he uncovered disturbed him in ways he had not anticipated. All the victims were members of the same fraternal order. All had been implicated in documented violence against freedmen. All had been killed in a manner suggesting intimate access and personal vengeance. The notes found on the bodies referenced specific crimes that federal investigators had previously tried and failed to prosecute, stymied by witness intimidation and corrupt local courts. Marshal Holbrook spoke with dozens of individuals, white and colored, men and women, long-time residents and newcomers. He examined the crime scenes, read the coroner's reports, and studied the pattern of the assaults. Gradually, he pieced together the story of Celeste Dufresne, the enigmatic widow who had seduced and likely murdered at least 3 of the victims, and possibly all 5. But when he sought her, he found she had vanished. The steamboat manifest showed a woman matching her description had departed for New Orleans, yet authorities there had no record of her arrival. She had disappeared as completely as if she had never existed. Then Holbrook did something unorthodox. He began speaking with people in the freedmen's community, not as suspects, but as potential witnesses. He conversed with church elders, women who ran boarding houses, men who labored as craftsmen and field hands. He made it clear his objective was to see justice served, not to shield white criminals. And slowly, people began to talk. They told him of La Veuve Noire, the Black Widow, though none claimed to have seen her. They told him of the whispers circulating through their community, originating from someone who knew intimate details of the crimes each victim had committed. They told him of Sarah Boudreau's missing daughter, though no one knew for certain her whereabouts or her current appearance. And Isaiah, an elderly freedman, a former carpenter and now a church deacon, told him something that fundamentally altered the marshal's perception of the case. "You are searching for one woman. Isaiah said. "A single killer. But that is not the way of it. Do you truly believe one person could move through this parish killing white men and not be seen? Do you truly believe one woman could possess all the knowledge she required and be in all the necessary places without assistance?" Holbrook leaned forward. "What are you saying?" "What I am saying," Isaiah continued carefully, "is that justice is a heavy burden, too heavy for one set of shoulders to carry alone. I am saying that when the law fails its people, they find other ways, other means. And I am saying that perhaps you should cease looking for a solitary assassin and instead ask yourself why not one colored person in this entire parish has given you a single, useful detail to apprehend her. Why we have all, it seems, been struck blind and deaf when it comes to La Veuve Noire. It was the closest anyone would come to admitting the truth, that the freedmen's community was protecting the killer, or killers, because they did not view the murders as crimes, but as justice long delayed. That what was happening to the Knights was righteous, necessary, and overdue. Marshal Holbrook was now in an impossible position. He could arrest freedmen on suspicion of conspiracy, but that would require military force and would only confirm their belief that the federal government was their enemy. He could continue a fruitless hunt for a ghost, a woman protected by an entire population's silent consent. Or he could quietly close his investigation, file a report citing a lack of evidence and uncooperative witnesses, and allow the delayed justice of Street Martin Parish to run its final, bloody course. Probably provoke the very racial conflict he was sent to prevent. He could attempt to press charges through the local courts, but those courts were controlled by the very men he would be accusing, individuals who possessed no moral standing and zero credibility within the colored community. He could summon federal troops and impose martial law, but that would be an admission of the complete collapse of Louisiana's civil authority. Instead, he did something that would haunt his professional reputation for years to come. He filed a report concluding the homicides appeared to be the work of a transient criminal, possibly a female using the alias Celeste Dufresne, who had since fled the jurisdiction. He issued a federal warrant for her arrest. He advised the remaining Knights to exercise extreme caution, but noted that without cooperative witnesses or conclusive physical evidence, further investigative efforts were unlikely to yield results. He then returned to Baton Rouge, leaving the parish to its own devices. Only 6 Knights remained: Jessup, Thibodeau, Judge Thibodeau, Sheriff Devereaux, Duplantis, and Arsenault. They understood the federal government had abandoned them. They were isolated, facing an invisible, untraceable enemy. Their only protection was their own dwindling resources and failing nerve. They transformed their homes into fortresses. They hired additional guards, stockpiled more weapons, and only ventured out when absolutely necessary, always traveling in groups, never alone and never unarmed. They scoured their pasts, trying to determine which of their many transgressions had made them targets and which victim's family might be seeking retribution. They waited for the next death, which arrived sooner than anticipated. The horror in Street Martin Parish deepens just when you thought it had reached its peak. If this tale is sending chills down your spine, share this video with a friend who appreciates a dark mystery. If you enjoy our content, please hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a story like this. Let's discover what happens next, together. William Duplantis was killed on October 1st, in the daytime, within his plantation home, a place believed to be secure. 3 armed guards patrolled the grounds outside while he worked alone in his study, reviewing his accounts. His throat was slit as he sat at his desk, and the assailant escaped through a window that had been unlatched from the inside, suggesting the escape route had been prepared in advance. The note left on his body referenced the Christmas massacre of 1868, when Duplantis led a nocturnal raid on a freedmen's settlement, burning homes and murdering 5 men who were attempting to register voters. Federal investigators at the time had been unable to prove Duplantis's involvement, despite numerous witnesses, all of whom had altered their testimonies after visits from masked men. Charles Arsenault was next, slain 2 weeks later in the warehouse where he stored his cotton. He had gone there with Sheriff Devereaux and 2 deputies to investigate a reported break-in. In the confusion of searching the dark building, Arsenault became separated from the group. Minutes later, they discovered him with his throat cut, his blood soaking into the cotton bales he had accumulated through the unpaid or underpaid labor of freedmen. The note read, Remember the theft you called business. 7 men were dead. The 4 surviving knights were beginning to fracture under the strain. Marcus Thibodeau ceased publishing his newspaper, claiming illness, but in reality, he was barricaded inside his home, drinking heavily and jumping at every noise. Judge Thibodeau moved his family out of the parish entirely and conducted his business from Baton Rouge, only returning to Breaux Bridge for court sessions and never staying overnight. Harold Jessup was forced to close his hotel, as no travelers would lodge in a building connected to multiple murders. Only Sheriff Devereaux maintained his public duties. He now traveled with a permanent escort of 4 armed deputies and took to sleeping in the parish jail instead of his own home, feeling a duty to maintain some semblance of order as the nominal head of law enforcement, even while knowing he was powerless to stop the killings. The others missed the pattern, but Devereaux saw it. He was reviewing the dates of the murders, marking them on a calendar, when he realized they were not random. Each death followed a strict timetable, occurring precisely 2 weeks after the last. It suggested the killer was orchestrating the deaths with planning and control, not merely seizing opportunities. If the pattern held, the next death would fall on October 29th. He shared this discovery with the other remaining knights, himself, Jessup, Thibodeau, and Judge Thibodeau. They met inside the jail, in a cell with barred windows and guards at the door, the only place they felt marginally safe. "She's playing with us," Jessup said, his voice ragged from whiskey and lack of sleep. "She wants us to know it's coming. She's trying to drive us mad with the waiting." "Then we use it," Devereaux countered. "We know the date. We prepare. All 4 of us stay together in a single, secure location, surrounded by armed men. We make ourselves an impossible target. We break the pattern." They devised a plan. They would gather in the parish courthouse on October 28th. The building was constructed like a fortress, with thick walls and few points of entry. They would bring in provisions for several days and a sufficient force of armed men to secure the perimeter. They would wait out the deadline together, and when November arrived with no new death, the killer would lose their psychological advantage. It seemed a sound strategy, a way to reclaim a measure of control. They did not know they were walking directly into the killer's design. While the knights planned their defense, another kind of preparation was underway within the freedmen's community. Women gathered in the church for what appeared to be prayer meetings. Men assembled tools and materials under the guise of making building repairs. Young people moved back and forth, carrying messages, relaying supplies, forming a communications network invisible to white authorities. In the small house behind the church, Celeste, if that was still her name, met with the group that had aided her from the beginning. Marie, the hotel maid who had overheard the night's plans, was there. So was Charlotte, the woman who had impersonated Celeste on the steamboat. Isaiah, the deacon who had steered Marshal Holbrook's investigation astray, was present, and there were others, men and women who had lost family to the night's violence, each carrying their own scars and their own grief. They had been waiting years for this moment. "They believe they can hide in the courthouse," Celeste stated. "They believe they can wait us out. They fail to understand this was never about timing or opportunity. This was always about justice. And justice does not halt simply because they barricade themselves behind stone walls." She unfolded a map of Breaux Bridge, marking locations and routes. "The courthouse possesses one vulnerability they have overlooked. During the 1867 renovations, they installed a coal chute for the heating system. It runs from the basement to the street, concealed by a grate that can be opened from the exterior. It is barely wide enough for a person, but it will suffice." "And once you are inside?" Isaiah asked. "Then I do what I have always done," Celeste replied, her voice steady. "I remind them that there are crimes the law cannot touch and debts that can only be settled in blood. And I ensure the final 4 know precisely why this is happening and whose daughter I am before they die." The meeting continued deep into the night, finalizing details, assigning roles, preparing for the final act of a performance 4 years in the making. Celeste was changed from the woman who had arrived in Breaux Bridge. The polished veneer of Madame Dufresne had been stripped away, leaving behind a figure forged harder and colder by grief and rage into an instrument of vengeance. But she had also changed in ways she had not foreseen. She had forged bonds with those who protected her, and she had inspired a community to become more than just accomplices to her revenge. She had become a symbol, la veuve noire, the widow who struck at the very power structure that had oppressed them for generations. Whatever happened next, whether she lived or died in the attempt, she had already achieved something profound. She had demonstrated that the knights were not invincible, that justice could find them where the law could not, and that there was a reckoning for cruelty, even in a world designed to protect the cruel. On October 28th, the 4 surviving knights gathered inside the parish courthouse with 8 armed guards. They brought provisions, water, firearms, and lanterns. They barred every entrance and stationed sentries at key positions to watch the windows and doors. Judge Thibodeau surveyed the building's structure, noting the thick walls and the limited points of entry. Sheriff Devereaux positioned his deputies in a perimeter around the building. "We are as secure here as we can possibly be," he stated. "Now, we wait." Night fell over Breaux Bridge, heavy with the heat and humidity of a Louisiana October. The courthouse stood on a slight rise in the center of town, its windows glowing with lamplight, the shadows of armed men visible behind the glass. The surrounding town was unnervingly quiet, as if the entire population had collectively decided to stay indoors and await the unfolding events unseen. In the colored section, people gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones, praying, singing hymns that drifted on the still air. They, too, were waiting. Celeste emerged from the house behind the church at midnight. She was clad now in dark, practical clothing that allowed for free movement, a world away from Madame Dufresne's fine dresses. She carried a small bag holding the tools she would require. Her hair was pulled back tightly, her face a mask of resolve that made her seem both younger and immeasurably older. A woman whose childhood had been stolen by violence and whose adulthood had been dedicated to answering it. Isaiah walked with her part of the way, accompanied by 3 other men who watched the alleys. They avoided the main thoroughfares, moving through back lanes and yards, following the paths people of color had learned over generations to navigate unseen. When they reached the edge of the town square, Isaiah gripped her arm. "You do not have to do this," he whispered. "You have already done more than anyone could ask. You have shown them they are not above judgment. Let that be enough." Celeste looked at him with eyes that held no mercy, no forgiveness, and no doubt. "My mother died begging them for mercy. Did they grant it? Did they ponder whether revenge upon her was enough? Or did they take everything? Her husband, her home, her life, her daughter's future. This ends when they are all dead, Isaiah, not before." She pulled away and melted into the shadows, moving toward the courthouse that loomed against the night sky like a monument to the very injustice she had spent 4 years trying to redress. The coal chute grate came away surprisingly easily, as if the bolts had been loosened beforehand. Celeste slipped through the opening, landing silently in the courthouse basement. The room was dark, crowded with old furniture and archived records, the air thick with the smell of coal dust and neglect. She waited, allowing her eyes to adjust, listening for any sign her entry had been detected. There was nothing. The guards were all focused on the main entrances, the obvious points of ingress. No one had considered the coal chute, little used since the renovation. She moved soundlessly through the basement, locating the stairs to the ground floor. This was the perilous part. The courthouse layout offered few places to hide, and the guards were alert for trouble. But Celeste possessed advantages they could not anticipate. She knew the precise location of every creaking floorboard, which corridors held the deepest shadows, and where the guards would be posted based on standard procedures, information gleaned from Marie and others who cleaned the building. More critically, she knew the knights would be gathered together, likely in the main courtroom or Judge Thibodeau's chambers, clinging to the safety of numbers. There would be guards at the doors, but they would not be expecting an attack from within the fortress. They anticipated a threat from the outside, a mob of angry freedmen, a direct assault. They were not prepared for someone already inside their walls. She paused on the ground floor, listening. Voices echoed from down the hall, the sound of men talking, a nervous laugh, the strained sound of men trying to convince themselves they were safe. The noise led her to the main courtroom, where lamplight bled from beneath the closed double doors. Celeste checked the contents of her bag one final time. The knife, honed sharp enough to slice through leather in a single stroke. The 4 notes she had pre-written, each detailing a specific crime. The small bottle of chloroform and a cloth, in case silent incapacitation was required. And the photograph, creased and faded, that she had carried for 4 years. It was the only picture she had of her mother, taken by an itinerant photographer in 1866, when hope still existed and freedom felt like the dawn of a better world, not the beginning of a new kind of hell. She studied the image in the faint light from the hallway windows. Her mother smiled at the camera, young, beautiful, and filled with resolve. Sarah Boudreau had believed in the law, in justice, in the promise that the federal government would protect its newly freed citizens. She had testified against her assailants, trusting the system, and it had murdered her for that faith. Celeste carefully refolded the photograph and returned it to her bag. Then she moved toward the courtroom doors, her knife ready, her heart a steady, cold drumbeat. She had accepted the high probability of her own death years ago. This was never about survival. It was about balance. It was about ensuring evil did not go unanswered, and that her mother's death had consequences. She tested the door handle and found it locked from within. She had anticipated this. Moving to a nearby window, she quietly worked the latch loose with her blade. The window swung inward with a soft creak that sounded like thunder in the silent building, but the noise did not seem to carry to the courtroom. She slipped inside, entering a small clerk's office that connected to the main room by an interior door. This door was slightly ajar. She opened it just enough to peer through. The 4 knights were clustered near the judge's bench, weapons close at hand. 3 of the guards were stationed at the main doors. The others were likely patrolling the exterior. Jessup drank from a silver flask. Thibodeau repeatedly mopped sweat from his brow despite the coolness of the night. Judge Thibodeau appeared engrossed in reading legal papers, a facade of normalcy. Sheriff Devereaux stood vigil at a window, staring out at the darkened town. "How much longer?" Jessup slurred. 5 hours until dawn," Devereaux replied without turning. "Then we are past the deadline. Then we know she cannot keep her schedule." "Unless she is already in the building," Thibodeau muttered. The others glared at him, their irritation born of fear. "I am serious. What if she found a way in? What if she is waiting for us to lower our guard?" "The building is secure," Judge Thibodeau stated firmly. "We checked every door and window. The only way in is through the doors, and they are all guarded. We are safe here. We merely need to remain disciplined until morning." The irony was not lost on Celeste. They had checked every entrance except the one they had forgotten, the one used by servants and laborers, the one that was beneath their notice. It was a perfect metaphor for their entire worldview. They saw only what they expected to see, what fit their understanding of how the world operated. It had never occurred to them that justice might arrive from below, through the forgotten channels and invisible people they had spent their lives ignoring. She waited, as patient as death itself, observing their patterns, noting when the guards shifted positions, when their attention wavered, when a back was turned. She saw that Jessup's drinking made him careless, that Thibodeau's fear made him jumpy but predictable, that the judge's pretense of normalcy meant his focus was on his papers and not his surroundings, that the sheriff's vigilance was directed outward, not inward. When the guards had settled into the rhythm of their watch and a lassitude had begun to seep into the room, she made her move. She stepped from the clerk's office into the courtroom, closing the door softly behind her. Before anyone registered her presence, she assessed the situation with the cold calculation of someone who had planned for this exact moment. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said, her voice low but clear. Heads swiveled. The guards at the doors started, raising their rifles. For a heartbeat, there was only stunned silence, a collective disbelief at her apparition. "Madame Dufresne," Sheriff Devereaux said finally, "or should I call you something else?" "My name," Celeste stated, "is Josephine Boudreau. I am the daughter of Sarah and Marcus Boudreau, whom you murdered in 1868. I have come to collect the debt you owe my family." She said it without rage, without theatrics, simply stating a fact. In that moment, the other knights understood they had gravely misjudged this woman. She was not a hysteric. She was a focused, calculated, and utterly controlled force. She had walked into their fortress, past their guards, and into the heart of their defensive position. She stood before them, apparently unarmed and utterly unafraid, because she had already won. She had already achieved her primary objective. Whether she killed them tonight or not, whether she escaped or was captured, she had terrorized them. She had shown them that judgment would find them, even if it took years. "Guards," Judge Thibodeau commanded, his voice cracking, "arrest her, take her into custody." But the guards hesitated. The woman standing before them radiated such certainty, such lack of fear, that they were reluctant to approach. She seemed like a vessel that might shatter into something even more dangerous if touched. "You may try to take me," Josephine said. You may shoot me, arrest me, drag me to a cell, but before you do, you should know that I am not alone. I never have been. Every person in the colored section of this town knows where you are tonight and what I am doing. If I do not walk out of this courthouse alive, if I do not give the signal that all has concluded according to plan, they have orders to burn this building to the ground with all of you inside. It was a lie, but not a complete one. The freedmen's community knew where she was, and they would undoubtedly riot if she were killed. But Josephine had given no such order. In fact, she had instructed Isaiah to keep everyone away from the courthouse, to let her face the consequences of her actions alone. The Knights, however, did not know that. They only knew that the colored population of Breaux Bridge vastly outnumbered the white, that racial violence was a tinderbox, and that they were trapped in a building that could easily become a tomb. Sheriff Devereaux. "What do you want?" Devereaux asked, his voice tight. "I want you to know why you are going to die," Josephine replied. "I want you to understand this is not random violence or the work of a madwoman. This is justice. It is imperfect. It is late, and it exists outside the law because the law failed us. But it is justice nonetheless." Then, in a voice devoid of emotion yet filled with absolute certainty, she began to recount the story of every crime, every assault, every murder, every act of terror committed by these 4 men and their deceased brethren. She named the victims, described the events, and provided dates and locations with the meticulous detail of a court transcript. She had spent 4 years gathering this intelligence, cross-referencing every fact, ensuring that when this moment came, there could be no denial, no evasion, no claim of mistaken identity. The Knights listened in horror as their sins were laid bare. Each man had been aware of individual crimes, but hearing them compiled, spoken in that relentless, chronological recitation, painted a portrait of systematic terror that was almost unbearable. This was what they had done. They had built this mountain of pain and death, of ruined lives, murdered innocents, and shattered families. And until now, they had never been forced to confront the sum of it. "You are confessing," Judge Thibodeau said, trying to reassert control. "Everything you have just said is a confession to multiple murders. We have witnesses. These guards heard every word." Josephine offered a thin smile. "Then arrest me. Put me on trial. Let me testify in open court to everything I have just said. Let me call witnesses from the freedmen's community. Let me introduce evidence of every crime these men committed. Let us have a public trial where all of this is brought into the light. I am certain the federal authorities in Baton Rouge would be most interested." The judge fell silent. Even if she were convicted, a public trial would destroy them. The scandal would be total and permanent. There was a very real chance sympathetic northern newspapers would take up her cause, that she would become a martyr, and that the trial would expose the entire system of terror that had ruled Louisiana since the war's end. "What do you want?" Devereaux asked again, the fight draining from his voice. "I want what any victim wants," Josephine said. "I want justice. But since the law will not provide it, I will have to settle for balance. 7 of you are dead, 4 of you remain. I will make you an offer, though I do not expect you to accept it. You can surrender yourselves to the federal government, publicly confess your crimes, face trial and imprisonment, and see your reputations burned to ash. Or you can refuse and take your chances with me. Those are your only choices." "And what if we arrest you right now?" Jessup slurred. "Hang you tonight and say you attacked us? Then you will have to explain to Marshal Holbrook why you executed a woman without a trial, in secret, in the middle of the night. You will face the investigation, the scrutiny, the questions about why she targeted you specifically. You will risk federal troops imposing martial law. And you will live with the knowledge that the freedmen's community will have their retribution, one way or another, now or 10 years from now. Is that a risk you are willing to take?" The standoff stretched, seconds turning into minutes, the tension coiling until the very air seemed to vibrate with it. And then, unexpectedly, Judge Thibodeau let out a short, weary laugh. "She is right," he said. "We have no good choices. We never did. The moment we decided the law did not apply to us, the moment we started down this path, we guaranteed this end. Perhaps not this exact end, but something like it. She calls it delayed justice. Perhaps she is correct. Perhaps this is simply the bill finally coming due." He stood, moving slowly as if the weight of all his years had settled upon him at once. "I will not confess. I will not turn myself in. I do not have that kind of courage. But I will not fight you any longer, either. I am finished. If you wish to kill me, kill me. If you wish to let me live in fear for whatever time I have left, do that. I do not care anymore. I am simply tired. It was not quite surrender. It was exhaustion. The final, hollowed-out resignation of a man who has realized he has already lost. The other 3 knights stared at him with a mixture of fury and envy. Fury at his capitulation, envy of his honesty. I am not ready to die, Sheriff Devereaux stated, his jaw clenched. And I am not ready to surrender. He drew his revolver, leveling it at Josephine. You are under arrest for the murder of 7 men. You will be tried and you will hang. That is how this ends. But before he could take another step, before the violence could erupt, a new sound filled the courthouse. It was singing, a multitude of voices rising from outside the building. The guards at the windows called out in alarm. A crowd of freedmen and freedwomen had gathered in the square, having come from across the parish. They held torches and lanterns, and they were singing the hymns that had carried them through slavery, war, and the difficult years of Reconstruction. They were not there to fight. They had come to bear witness, to ensure the world saw and remembered what transpired in the courthouse that night, and to demonstrate that Josephine Boudreau was not alone. They had come to reclaim the courthouse, this symbol of law and justice, surrounding it with their bodies and their voices, refusing to remain invisible any longer. Sheriff Devereaux slowly lowered his revolver. He understood the situation had shifted irrevocably. He could not shoot Josephine without igniting a riot. He could not take her into custody without moving through a crowd that would not allow it, who had witnessed everything. He could not make her disappear without guaranteeing the story would spread across the state and force a federal intervention. He knew he was defeated. On October 29th, dawn broke over Breaux Bridge. The courthouse remained surrounded by freedmen who had stood vigil through the night. Inside, the confrontation had concluded, not with bloodshed, but with a strange, unsatisfying bargain that nonetheless resolved the immediate crisis. Josephine Boudreau walked out of the courthouse at first light. The guards made no move to stop her, and the crowd parted respectfully to let her pass. She had not killed the remaining knights, though she had been prepared to. Instead of their lives, she had accepted something more valuable: acknowledgement. Judge Thibodeau had written out a full confession documenting every crime committed by the Knights of the White Chimera in Street Martin Parish. It was signed, dated, and witnessed by his fellow knights. The document would never be entered as evidence in any official proceeding or filed in any court. But it existed, held in trust by leaders within the freedmen's community, a sword of Damocles forever hanging over the heads of the men who had caused so much suffering. In exchange, Josephine agreed to leave Louisiana and never return. She agreed to spare the lives of the remaining knights on the condition they never again engaged in organized terror. If they did, the agreement was void. She agreed to vanish, to become a ghost like the mysterious Celeste Dufresne, allowing the story to solidify into legend rather than fact. It was not perfect justice. 3 men who deserved the gallows would live out their lives, unpunished by any court. They were known as monsters within their community, but their wealth and connections would insulate them. But it was an admission of guilt, a recognition of their crimes, and a permanent reminder that their actions had consequences, even when the law looked away. The 4 knights who survived that night were never the same. Judge Thibodeau resigned his position and moved to Texas, where he died 2 years later, from drink and despair. Sheriff Devereaux lost his next election to a coalition of freedmen and progressive whites who finally found the courage to vote against him. Harold Jessup sold his hotel and left the state. Marcus Thibodeau continued publishing his newspaper, but his influence was broken. His editorials grew increasingly bitter and disconnected from the changing world around him. That fall, the power of the Ku Klux Klan in Street Martin Parish came to an end. The organization, stripped of its leadership and its promise of impunity, disintegrated. Reconstruction would continue, imperfect and incomplete, but the reign of terror that had gripped the parish since the war's end was finally over. And Josephine Boudreau, who had been an instrument of vengeance for 4 years, disappeared from history. Some said she went to Mexico, others said Canada or France. The truth was more mundane and more practical. She moved to New York City, changed her name once more, and spent the rest of her life working with organizations that fought for the rights of freedmen, using her intelligence and her hard-won experience to help others navigate the perilous landscape of post-war America. She never spoke publicly of what happened in Breaux Bridge. She never wrote a memoir, gave an interview, or sought credit for what she had done. She lived a quiet, purposeful life until her death in 1903 at the age of 47. She was buried in an unmarked grave in Brooklyn, but in Louisiana, the story of La Veuve Noire was passed down through generations in the colored communities of the Bayou parishes. It became a part of the secret history of Reconstruction. The stories freed people told one another of resistance and survival, of how ordinary people fought back against extraordinary oppression. Over time, the details blurred, were embellished or simplified, and blended with other tales of retribution and justice. But the core remained: a woman, her family destroyed by the Klan, who exacted a price from the killers and proved that even the most powerful men were not beyond reach. Historians would later debate whether Josephine Boudreaux was a real person and if any of the story was true. The official records showed the murders, but attributed them to an unknown assailant who was never caught or identified. The signed confession from Judge Thibodeau was never found, though oral histories collected in the 1,930 seconds make reference to it. There is no record of a Celeste Dufresne in New Orleans, suggesting the identity was either a fabrication or a cover so deep her true self was erased. But a lack of proof is not the same as a lack of truth. In an era where so much violence was carefully expunged from the official record, where so many crimes went unpunished and unacknowledged, and where justice for freed people was often an abstract concept, stories like that of La Veuve Noire served a vital purpose. They reminded people that one could fight back, that the powerful were not invincible, and that courage, planning, and patience could achieve what the law and the government could not. And sometimes, in the quiet of the night, in places where memory holds more weight than written history, you can still hear the old truth being passed along, from grandmother to grandchild, from elder to youth. There are debts the law cannot collect. There are crimes the courts cannot punish. There are injustices so profound they must be addressed outside the bounds of civilized society. And when that time comes, when people are forced to choose between enduring oppression or fighting back with whatever tools they possess, ordinary people can do extraordinary things. 7 men died in the summer and fall of 1872. Their throats were cut, and their crimes were finally answered. 4 lived, but they were never whole again. And in the shadows of history, a woman named Josephine Boudreaux found a measure of peace, knowing her mother's killers had been called to account, and that justice, however imperfect, bloody, and extra-legal, had been served. What are your thoughts on this story? Could this have truly happened in Reconstruction-era Louisiana? Do you believe vengeance can ever be a substitute for justice, or does it merely perpetuate the cycle of violence? Please leave your comments below. I read everyone, and now I want to know what you think. If you've made it this far, and this tale has moved you, unsettled you, or made you consider the hidden costs of history, please subscribe to this channel and hit the bell. Share this video with someone who appreciates dark, true historical crime. These stories matter. We need to listen to these voices, and together we can ensure they are never forgotten. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.